That's it. The sun has set on pre-season testing 2019 in Formula 1. The final day of running is in the books at Barcelona. And the big story of today, Mercedes finally showing some real pace in the W10. Not topping the times, but Lewis Hamilton coming within fractions of beating Sebastian Vettel's chart-topping time in the Ferrari. I'm joined by Tom Errington and Ed Straw to analyse today's running. Hamilton very close to Vettel. The pace looked good, probably for the first time in all of pre-season for Mercedes, but you've been crunching the numbers and perhaps it looks as though Ferrari still has the edge.
Yeah, I think so. Although the headline lap times are near as makes no difference identical, we did see, actually shortly after Vettel had done that time, he went out on C3, so that's the middle compound. It's 1 to 5, hardest to softest, and he did a 1 minute 16.720 on the C3s. Now, if you do a fairly conservative even adjustment for the grip level advantage you get on C5s versus C3s, that puts him down into the high 15s, even conservatively a 15.9, which kind of restores that 0.3 gap that we've been building up over the past few days. So I think, yeah, the Mercedes is reasonably quick, but I still think Ferrari is ahead, and I think it was that lap, which was shortly before lunch, that really shows the underlying advantage of the Ferrari.
Do you think there was any extra pace left in the Mercedes, and could that car have snuck under the 1 minute 16 barrier?
I'm sure if they went all out to, they could have done. They will still have done their qualifying simulations with a bit of fuel on board, could easily be 20, 30 kilos. Ferrari will have done the same. So I'm sure the Mercedes could have been a little bit quicker, just as I think the Ferrari could have been a little bit quicker.
Cancelling each other out effectively.
Exactly. I think the one interesting thing was that had Vettel put his best sectors together, even on the comparable C5 times, he'd have been maybe a couple of tenths quicker. So I think that again points to the idea that the Ferrari has got a bit in hand. But not bad for Mercedes still, but not at Ferrari's level.
Tom, the sounds coming out of the Mercedes camp before that run, we should say, from Hamilton were much less positive. Hamilton suggested perhaps that Ferrari could be even as much as half a second clear heading to Melbourne. Do you think they'll be more encouraged now that Hamilton's done that run, or do you think that, as it's looked kind of during the rest of pre-season, that Mercedes still has a lot of work to do to get properly in the fight?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think from where they started and where they are now, there's a lot to be confident with there. We've seen the long runs look really comparable to Ferrari. Again, probably like Ed said, you're looking at 0.3 off, that sort of thing again. Short runs, they're looking a lot better than they were. They're in their Australian spec package as well, and they seem to get a good understanding with that. Bottas talked the other day as well about how he feels much more confident with the car than he did before when he pinpointed the handling problems. I think we're now in that bit of a media game that we've seen throughout with Mercedes and Ferrari. Toto Wolff's very good at playing up the opposition. Hamilton putting half a second on it. They know the Ferrari's ahead. I'm sure they've put a little bit on top of that as a bit of a buffer for themselves. Particularly when you look from the Ferrari side of things, you've got Binotto playing down the fact they've got an advantage. So you're going to have this brinkmanship throughout. We'll have it after Australia. We'll have it towards the end of the season. That's not going to change. The main thing is what we see is that Ferrari is ahead by a little bit.
Yeah, Binotto said it would be a mistake for anyone to say that they're ahead, but we're nailing our colours to the mast and saying they definitely are. But one team not in the mix today, Red Bull. 2 disastrous days, really. The Pierre Gasly crash, spectacular, of yesterday, seemed to compromise them getting out on track. Today with Max Verstappen, he didn't do many laps. They had a gearbox problem as well. Difficult day for them. Where do they really go from here? It's really difficult to know where they stand, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. If you'd asked me this question at 10 a.m, I'd have said they look absolutely fine. They missed half an hour this morning before Verstappen was out. But then, as we saw quite quickly, there were older parts on that car. So that's a setback already. And Verstappen did 29 laps in the end, and we didn't see him at all in the afternoon. We didn't see a performance run at all. So it makes it very, very difficult for us to stack them up against Mercedes and Ferrari because we just haven't seen that level of mileage. We haven't seen the performance labs. We've only really got a few long runs to go on. And again, that's tricky when you account fuel and all the rest of it as well. So right now, it's very difficult to say where they stand. I suppose one of the main positives they can take from it is across Honda and Toro Rosso, the Honda engine seems to be working very well. I think Tanabe was saying only very minor issues here and there, and it hasn't impacted mileage. So, all good from that side of things. But yeah, the overall picture is very murky at the moment.
Yeah, reliability's certainly been a positive aspect for the Red Bull-Honda partnership. Ed, you've been obviously crunching the numbers hard. Can you give us any indication of where Red Bull-Honda stands? Can you peer through the murk and give us some clarity?
There's no lap or run in the Red Bull that's emphatic, shall we say. There are a few race runs earlier on that hinted that you could maybe compare to the Ferrari that was about half a second off. I don't think they're entirely representative. I would probably put, if I had to, because the data for the Red Bull is tricky, because normally over 8 days you get a pretty good picture, but the disruption over the last day and a half has really, really damaged that. The one thing I would say is the race run Gasly was on when he crashed wasn't anything particularly extraordinary, but we would have seen more from Verstappen today. I'd say their range is about 0.3 to 0.5 off Ferrari.
Okay.
Which puts them either maybe just ahead, level neck and neck with, or just behind where Mercedes are. So yeah, I think they're in reasonable shape. They could be just ahead of Mercedes, but there's nothing we can emphatically say shows that. Because I think at the moment you'd probably have to say they're probably in a similar level to Mercedes, but maybe there's a little bit other way. It's very, very tricky. But what we can say is they've not lost out compared to where they were last year by going from Renault to Honda.
Yeah, they'll certainly be at least third best in Melbourne, and probably a better third best, even if they are indeed behind Ferrari and Mercedes. The team that perhaps possibly had an even more woeful day than Red Bull, despite completing many more laps, Williams. I mean, it seems a bit hard to be kicking a team while they're down, but Robert Kubica, having put a brave face on much of the winter so far, seemed to finally lose his rag with the car today. Tom, you talk us through Kubica's programme and also his reaction after stepping out of the car.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, figuring out the programme is very, very difficult because they had to alter their plan today and look more ahead to Australia, which meant spare parts weren't there. And for Kubica, that made his programme very, very difficult. Certainly when we looked at his long runs in particular, the drop-off over 10 laps was really, really big. Too much so, really, you'd say. When we looked earlier in the week when Russell was in the car, you're looking at about 1.6 seconds drop-off over 10 laps on the C2 is what we saw, which isn't great at all, obviously. But yeah, and then we saw in the afternoon where Kubica just seemed to do in-lap, out-lap, and just pit-stop practice, in effect, writing off the afternoon. So when he got out of the car and said that he feels like he knows 20% of the car in its current state, and that's a huge thing to admit. But then also, probably more disappointing for Williams is the fact that he said that he felt encouraged earlier in the week with the car, and Paddy Lowe himself has said that Kubica thinks this car is better than last year's, and when you consider he'd done quite a lot of mileage in that in testing, that's all positive. And we seem to get this feeling that the Williams car is quite basic, but they seem to have got a grasp on it working on the harder compounds, and they've got a base to work with. But on the C4 and C5, they look nowhere. They were over a second off Perez, and the Racing Point, very basic car. We don't think it's anywhere near what it'll be in Australia as well. So they really ended it on a sour note when actually the story could have been that they'd recovered quite well from missing quite a lot of testing.
Yeah, the Williams almost seems to have degraded a bit as the week has gone on. I think, naturally they're short of parts considering the car was late being built. It seems things have got a bit worn out, and obviously you start to lose the integrity of the data you're gathering. The Williams doesn't look particularly strong on track, and is obviously at the back of the midfield group, but we started to get a clearer idea at the front end of the midfield that the Renault and the Haas are moving ahead. We saw today that Nico Hülkenberg's 16.8 is more representative of where they're at. Romain Grosjean did a 17.0. We probably think that car's running a bit heavy compared to some of the midfield competitors. Would you say those are the two leading lights in the Class B battle?
At the moment, yes. I have a sneaking suspicion it might prove to be Haas by the time we get to Australia, particularly with how well they had it hooked up there last year. I think the Haas is a very strong car. It handles well. The drivers can do what they want with it. Really responsive. So that set them in good stead. The Renault, they had a kind of up and down test. I know they were having to be quite careful because they didn't have a great deal of spare parts. They could not afford to have a crash. So I think the drivers have been a little bit more on the leash, should we say, than they'd like to be. But yeah, one of those two. Alpha is there about, but I think a little bit back. I don't think
they've flatlined a little bit.
Yeah, they've not made the progress over this 8 days of testing. At the start, you just said, they could be right at the front of the midfield. I think they'll be thereabouts, but you put them behind those two. There's sort of two groups of three in the midfield. There's those three cars, and then you've got Toro Rosso, Racing Point, and McLaren. Toro Rosso and Racing Point both expecting to make good incremental progress through the season and come on strong. McLaren battling understeer early on, have a car that looks a little bit unstable at the rear, as we said a few times. I think they've got some work to do. So you've got those sort of two groups in the midfield that seem to be the sort of two halves of it. But overall, it's a pretty tight Class B battle from what we can see.
And sadly, Williams off the back.
Yeah, half a second off the back, maybe more. It's not been great for them, and they've abandoned race sims the last couple of days. So the last few days have not gone well for them.